Hello, it is my great pleasure to welcome everybody to this reading and conversation with the Canadian poet Adamem Dickinson. Adam, welcome. Thank you to all of you who are watching us, and we invite you to make comments and ask questions. Thank you also to you who are here. Adamem Dickinson is a poet and researcher. He teaches at Brock University in Canada. He's the author of 4 books of poetry. His last book, Anatomic, it's one of the books from which we'll be reading today, involves the results of chemical and microbial testing on his own body. His previous book, Polymers, which will also be mentioned here, is a sort of poetic reflection and experiment involving different kinds of polymers, so artificial polymers such as plastics and also polymers occurring naturally in the human body. His work has been nominated for numerous prizes, the most important Canadian prizes, and translated into many languages, including Chinese, Dutch, French, German, Norwegian, now also Polish. I think Adam is definitely one of the most intriguing, most experimental, most groundbreaking voices in Anglophone poetry today. So I am super happy to have him with us in Warsaw. Welcome again.
Thank you. It is a huge pleasure for me to be here, so thank you very much.
Okay, so the plan for today's reading is that we will talk, and the conversation will be interspersed with readings from at least 2 books. Maybe there will be some new work as well at the end. But before we read some poems, and there will be some Polish translations as well. Most of the conversation is going to be in English, but we will also read some Polish translations by Joanna Piechura and myself from Adam's 2 books. But before we read, I would like to ask you a few questions.
Sure.
First of all, the question that really fascinates me, or the aspect of your work that I find so interesting, is how radically transdisciplinary it is. Yes, because we always talk about how the fact that we live in those 2 cultures, that there's this culture of, like, the scientific culture is completely separate from humanities or arts or poetry, how it's a problem because these 2 ways of knowing seem not to communicate with each other at all, and your work is an example of a completely different strategy. It is sometimes described as research-based poetry. I've read this characterization of your work, and the question which I'm going to ask you, which I'm going to start from, is actually a very simple question. What is the story behind your fascination with science and scientific methodology?
Okay. Well, maybe I should start at the very beginning. My father was a science teacher, but before that he did some research in biology, did a master's in biology, and continued when he was a teacher to perform some field work for some scientists through the early 1980s. And so as a child, I helped him with some of this work. I have fond memories of catching butterflies, actually. And we would catch them and tag them, because this was part of a research study trying to trace the routes that monarch butterflies would take from Mexico to eastern Canada. And so this of course inspired my imagination, but I have no formal training actually in science. I am trained in literature and literary studies, and that was the route that I chose to take, but I've always been interested in science. And so I suppose I have been interested for a few reasons. First of all, I think the world in which we live at the moment, there is a heavy emphasis on science and technology, and there's even a kind of, you might argue, a kind of technocratic emphasis in even among government structures, where there's this emphasis on a kind of mechanical industrial model. Now, but this of course isn't all science, but it emerges in some ways from some assumptions about science and scientific thinking. But it seems to me, given the presence, the important presence that technology has in our culture, as an artist, I feel compelled to want to respond to this and to use art as a response to science, to use the tools of science in some ways, to interrogate those tools, to interrogate some of those methods and procedures. I think that in some ways, some questions around truth and falsity in our society are often determined somewhat systematically. It's important, I think, to have other kinds of engagements with those questions and other discursive possibilities. And so I see the integration of science into artistic practices and methods as one way of posing some questions and asking us to think a little bit differently about technology and about the kinds of our relationship to the world in general. I mean, you and I have talked about this before as well. You know, Lawrence Buell famously says that the environmental crisis is not simply a crisis of technology, but also one of the imagination. And certainly I think that in this case, you know, there's an opportunity here for artists to integrate in a profound way. At least this is my interest, in integrating in a profound way, given the proliferation of technological possibilities in some of these questions and exploring what the imagination might have to offer. Altered or inflected forms of scientific thinking or scientific methods. So that's part of it. You know, I also think that as a writer, I am always looking for resources, different kinds of resources from which to draw in order to develop new poetic forms or even you know, become inspired for new potential questions to ask about the world in which I live. And I think that science is this, and scientific procedures and methods offer this tremendous resource. That's partly why I've become more interested in working in laboratories and with scientists, trying to incorporate some of their methods and procedures into my own work as a means of developing alternate forms of writing and alternate procedures for creative writing. So that's, yeah, I see science working at a number of levels in my own work. And I suppose I'll finish your question by saying as well, I think there's actually quite a bit of overlap between science and art, science and poetry. I think practiced at their limits, science and poetry or art generally, are asking similar questions, which is to say, you know, how do I draw from ostensibly different contexts of understanding and knowledge in order to solve pressing problems? This is a form of metaphorical thinking, ultimately. It's what artists do, and it is what scientists do as well, at the limits of their discipline. And so I think that, you know, there's a lot of overlap at those limits.
Lynn Keller last year spoke of two different but related forms of attention. Right, so when asked about science and poetry, that was her expression, two different but related forms of attention. Yeah, I was gonna also ask you, because I'm also fascinated by science, and maybe I don't use scientific methodology as much as you do, but I completely understand this attraction, and I think a lot of people in the humanities, especially what is called environmental humanities, now turn to sciences such as botany or geology. Yes, these are cool things. But what do you think? But I think it happens much more rarely on the side of science. I mean, I think it happens much more rarely that the so-called hard scientists are fascinated with the humanities or with with poetry. And this is perhaps a slightly sort of contrary question, but I wanted to ask you, what do you think poetry contributes, like, to this conversation? What do you think is the contribution of poetry specifically? Because we know what is the fascination and the contribution of science to art, but what is the contribution of poetry to science?
Well, science can develop and create tools for understanding the physical world and responding to the chemical world. I think poetry is, working in some ways with similar conceptual tools, but aiming those towards the social and cultural world. But in some ways asking similar kinds of questions. I think that the goal of art generally is to shift our frames of understanding or signification in some way, so that things that don't matter to us start to matter in different ways, and therefore that might inspire us to ask different questions about the world around us. Science is also aiming to solve particular problems, of course, and that does involve asking different questions about things too. But I think for poets and artists, it's about thinking about the repercussions of those things and you know, finding language in some ways to understand the changing technological world that we live in. It's one thing to, I mean, humans are you know, poesis, the root of poetry itself is to make, to build, to create. And we are always building and creating. I mean, science in many ways emerges from that impulse as well, to build, to create. And you know, and so we do this in a physical sense, of course, with material substances, but we also have to do this in a cultural and social sense and philosophical sense. And I think that, you know, poetry finds ways to respond to some of these things. I think, you know, the role of poetry, to my mind, is to press language and culture to its limits, to sort of live at the edge of language and culture, and therefore, in doing so, enacting experiments. I think actually the role of poetry in many ways is a kind of experimental enterprise to you know, persist there at the edge of language and culture, create little experiments, whatever they may be, however insignificant or strange or odd they may appear to be, but in doing so, prompt us to ask different questions and think differently about the world that we live in.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think this question of experiment is maybe another dimension where poetry and science actually can go hand in hand, yes? An experiment is about, like you said, it is about asking questions, so it's not necessarily about like getting measurable results, right? It's about, so like experiment can go in different directions and it can work or it can even fail. I mean, it's okay even if experiments fail sometimes, I think.
Well, I mean, I understand in science this is also a kind of prejudice that marks the discipline. You know, scientists want to be successful in their work. Of course, there's the idea with the scientific method that it's okay to fail, that we learn from our failures, but I think also there are pressures, and this is why you see forged data, this is why you see, you know, the pressure, I think, in certain fields of science to not fail at the work that is being done.
Yeah, but well, also what I mean is that you need a lot of experiments, and like you need a lot of experiments that are not necessarily successful in order to finally like come up with something that is like groundbreaking. Yes, so we need all kind of. I mean, that was.
I agree completely, and I would also add to that as well that, you know, we sometimes part of how the scientific method understands itself is that it builds on the work of predecessors. But I think artists do that too. You know, we're absolutely reading and engaged with work that comes before and tweaking and pushing that in other ways, critiquing it, finding different ways to stand in relation to it and push it somewhere else. So there's a lot of similarities and overlaps, I think.
Would you tell us a little bit about your beautiful book, Polymers?
Well, so this book is an experiment, I suppose, in thinking through plastics. I didn't want to just write a book. Of course, I had thought about plastic pollution, and plastic pollution is something I've thought about for a long time. And so I wanted to, I didn't want to just write a book thematically engaged with, you know, condemning plastic pollution in some way, or a kind of screed. That wasn't necessarily my interest. I wanted to find another way into sort of thinking through and working with plastic and reimagining plastic structures inside language. And so I started researching polymer chemistry, and you know, the polymer itself lent itself nicely, it seemed to me, as a potential poetics, given a few of its characteristics. So a polymer is a gigantic molecule made up of numerous repeating parts. It's actually quite a simple structure, but it is profoundly useful in the natural world and in the human world as well. There are polymers all over the place. Our DNA is a polymer. Our hair, our skin. These are just molecules that build on repeated units, little blocks, like long chains, like a kind of long spine in some cases. And when humans started to make use of petrochemicals, this opened up a fifth kingdom of possibilities. So we could, in some ways, begin to play God and create matter. And that's what, you know, polymer chemistry does. It is the invention, really, of another kind. Of course, it's not literally the invention of new matter, because we're just simply rearranging existing substances. Plastics are often just rearrangements of the same atoms, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. You throw in some sulfur and chlorine occasionally, and you just move these pieces around, like anagrams. Again, so I started thinking through sort of poetically around some of these ideas. The anagram as a rearrangement of letters in a poem, or a story to tell a different story, but using the exact same letters. And so that struck me as an overlap. I started thinking about the ways also we use and are engaged with all forms of repetition and iteration and accumulation in our culture. So I thought of certain social formations, like thinking through, what is an argument if not something that kind of builds and climbs and builds on itself. Even some of the we were just talking now about the way in which science emerges from predecessors, as art does too. You could see history in this way, the history of certain disciplines, or as being a kind of polymer, moving and shifting and building in its molecular structure. And so I looked around me for examples of this in language and in culture, and attempted to write some poems that both responded in some ways to some of these things and also employed, in some cases, some of these procedures or mechanisms that I identified. So there are a lot of poems that play with somewhat repeated forms, repeated rhetorical forms like the anaphora, which makes use of repeated phrases at the beginnings of lines, or polysyndeton, which you often see in the Bible, which is sort of and this and that and this and that, the sort of repetition of these kinds of coordinating conjunctions over and over again. And so I was intrigued as well, thinking, well, the Bible is filled with this. Is this a polymeric document? What does it mean to think of the Bible as a kind of plastic structure? And of course, when you start going down that metaphorical road, there's all kinds of ways to think of plasticity in religion and the Bible and faith in some ways along those lines. And so I started exploring some of those possibilities in the book. And I also wanted to, because plastic is this incredibly overdetermined substance, we make it do everything. Like here it is imitating wood. Actually, this may well be wood, I'm sorry. But you know what I mean. You can find fake wood everywhere you look. But it's meant to, in some ways, be invisible. It's meant to look like wood. Like it's a sort of mimetic a substance. It's meant to not be noticed in some cases. We're meant to simply mistake it for materials that we're already familiar with. Or our clothing, for example, cotton, polyester. I mean, you kind of have to look to see the difference in some cases. But it's everywhere around us, and so I wanted to find ways to engage with it differently, and that's what produced the book.
Okay, will you read from it?
Yeah, I will. Let's see here. I'll start with Hail. Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
Yeah, I should mention also this poem is there's the book shifts around in tone quite a bit because plastic itself also is this bizarrely overdetermined tonal structure. Plastic is hilarious, it's cheap, it's disturbing, it is serious and high technology, so it operates on all these different discursive registers. And I found that quite fascinating as well. So the book moves around. There's some intentionally funny poems in here. There's some very serious ones. There's ones that deal with the toxicity of plastic and others with its annoyance and pollution. Anyway, this poem is called Hail, and it makes use of anaphora, so these repeated phrases. So I think of this as a kind of linguistic polymer. Okay, Hail. Hello from inside the albatross with a windproof lighter and Japanese police tape. Hello from staghorn coral beds waving at the beaked whale's mistake. All 6 square meters of fertilizer bags. Hello from can-opened delta gators taxidermied with 25 grocery sacks and a Halloween Hulk mask. Hello from the zipped-up leatherback who shat bits of rope for a month. Hello from bacteria making their germinal way to the poles in the pockets of packing foam. Hello from low-density polyethylene drop stones glacially tilled by desiccated bowel-obstructed camels. Hello from six-pack rings and chokeholds. From breast milk and cord blood, from microfibers rinsed through yoga pants and polyester fleece, biomagnifying predators strafing the treatment plants. Hello from acrylics in G.I. Joe. Hello from washed up fishnet, thigh highs and frog suits and egg cups and sperm. Hello.
So I'm going to read a translation of this poem, which was made by Joanna Piechura, who's here with us. Okay. Cześć. Pozdrowienia ze środka Albatrosa. Jesteśmy tu z wiatroszczelną zapalniczką i japońską taśmą policyjną. Pozdrowienia z madreporowych, raf koralowych, witających skołowanego walenia, całe 6 metrów kwadratowych worków nawozu. Pozdrowienia z rozpuszkowanych aligatorów rzecznych, wypchanych 25 reklamówkami i halloweenową maską Hulka. Pozdrowienia ze spiętego żółwia skórzastego, który przez miesiąc srał resztkami sznura. Pozdrowienia z bakterii, które rozwijają się w drodze na bieguny, w bąbelkach pianki do pakowania. Pozdrowienia z polietylenowych skamielin o niskiej gęstości przeoranych jak lodowiec przez wychudłe wielbłądy z zaparciem. Pozdrowienia z pierścieni do sześciopaków i Nelsonów, z mleka matki i krwi pępowinowej, z mikrowłókien przesączonych przez leginsy i poliestrowej wełny, z wysoce stężonych drapieżników, które czyhają na oczyszczalnie. Pozdrowienia z farb akrylowych na figurkach G.I. Joe. Pozdrowienia z kabaretek wyrzuconych na brzeg i żabich kostiumów i jajeczników i spermy. Pozdrowienia. Okay, so if you would like to read us a couple more poems, maybe from polymers, I will be reading any more translations because I think it looks like from this book, because it looks like we planned a bit too much wanting to read everything. So if you could just read us maybe a couple more poems in English before we move on to Anatomic. Okay,
I'll read you. So this is an anagram, this piece. It's, so the poem is called Halter Top, Translating a Polyester. So the halter top, the sort of shirt worn in the summertime, made of polyester. So I took the most common form of polyester, which is polyethylene terephthalate, and I took all the letters in that word, those two words, polyethylene terephthalate, and I restricted myself to those letters in the composition of this poem. So you won't hear any other letters than what are in those in that word, those two words. Halter top. Let the python plot the thorn. Let the hornet paper the tree. Let pollen apron the path to the pharaoh. Neoprene phyla are really an alloy art. The telltale pattern, the protean trophy pelt. Nylon antelope threaten the Tylenol people. Open the paternal peephole to the athlete panther and her alternate entropy. Her teeth apply to the planetary apathy. They are polar. They are throttle. The error apparent to the hyperreal apple. So again, playing around with the anagram here as an analog to polymeric forms and polymeric structures. Okay, I'll read this piece also. It's kind of a story actually. So, I mean, part of the book is quite playful. And so this is an imagined company that would develop plastics around the sense of touch to achieve some kind of commercial end. It's speculative. I don't know if there's companies like this, although, I mean, maybe there are now. Haptics technology is everywhere. The poem is called Haptics. Inspired by cigarettes, folding chairs, and the flourished gestures that accompany escalating disagreements, Plasticus Corporation, a subsidiary of Dow Chemical, quietly moved into researching the biological effects of touch on memory. The idea was to engineer nostalgia into the flexible surfaces of goods. Take, for example, the proleptic goodbye of an ice cube tray, the Merry Christmas grip of a Swiss Army knife, or the complimentary blisters beveled by borrowed cash. Researchers impregnated experimental plastics with erotic, platonic, and ritualistic dispersants in order to approximate the uncanny in its unguent penetration into the rehearsals of the brain's transcriptional grease. Soon, the golden age of mothers was upon us. Wine pairings were devised, moods were adjusted. People saw their fingerprints blinking everywhere, like biometric avalanche beacons. In the midst of the frenzy, in bathrooms where blow dryers whipped pierced barley ears into Arcadian compost, in soliloquies sprung to life on the pocket-dialed sidewalks down memory lane, in gearboxed convertibles retrograding the open road, in Archimedean armchairs armed with bygone gamepads, in the protopathic nuzzling of machined memorabilia, the retraction went unnoticed. Plasticus had forged the data. All the handheld déjà vus made it feel like a publicity stunt. The hoax was taken for a hoax. and the polyester lilies went on feeling up the valley.
Thank you. I remember you once said, it could have been in one of the conversations we have had this past week, you said that what you like to, and I really, really loved this way of putting it, that you like to play at the edge of, or like you like to go to the edge of nonsense, the edge of sense, but without falling off. That's what you said, but without falling off, and that's I find it very, very helpful. Reading like this description, very helpful reading and translating your poems. And
it's a challenge to translate, isn't it?
It is
because
a challenge,
if you're on the edge of sense in English, I don't know. I mean, as a translator, that's an extra challenge to work with, isn't it? When you
yeah,
shift
I mean,
languages.
yeah. The challenge is that you have to understand where is this edge exactly. So, like, at which moment things are strange, yes, and at which moment they seem strange to you because you didn't get it or you didn't understand it. So, like, you have to, like, there are these moments when I'm not sure whether this is where this, like, strange sort of new inventive meanings begin, or is it just me not getting some idiomatic expression or something like this? So yeah, so that happens sometimes. Yeah, but but it's also extremely fascinating because you explore this plasticity and materiality of language in ways that I find extremely invigorating. And thinking about this, I wanted to ask you about, this term Ecopoetics, which, is the name of our school. Yes, the School of Ecopoetics. That's where, like, this, we often have meet in this very space. Yes, and I think that there is, it's a term that comes up quite a lot, and maybe there's even some misunderstanding around it. So I was wondering, what is your definition of ecopoetics, whether you ever use this term, whether this term is meaningful to you in any way?
Yeah, I would argue actually in some ways this term is the most useful for me among the various terms one might use to talk about the kind of work that I do. In part because I like how open it is at the moment, and I mean you are a part of defining this field too. I mean the school that you've set up here is a part of defining this field. It's a field that is, I think, by definition, open as well. I think it takes seriously the two words in its title, the eco, the ecological, and the poetics, to make, to build in some ways. How might these two things be integrated? And so I think what I find most interesting about ecopoetics as a term and a concept for me is that it's not restricted to poetry as such. In fact, it's not restricted to a style or form of any kind of writing at all. I can see ecopoetics as something, as a kind of architecture of thinking. From which poetry might emerge, but other forms of art might emerge too. And so I feel, especially as a writer, freedom to play around within that concept and explore visual dimensions, sonic dimensions, other things, and still call it ecopoetics. I think that, for me, it's a way of interrogating and reassessing and revising and re-engaging with the idea of nature writing in some way. How do we make nature writing adequate to this cultural moment? We can no longer simply stand back and write quiet pastorals about the world around us. I mean, of course, beauty and appreciating and writing. I'm not dismissing that kind of art. I'm just suggesting that ecopoetics in part works within that also to ask other questions, and questions not simply about social justice, which are extremely important, that's part of it, sort of thinking about environmental politics and activism within the art itself, but also to interrogate the language that not only that we use within art, but also within culture more generally, and especially within some of these discursive fields like environmental law or social justice, or questions of race and class and gender and privilege as they relate to questions about the environment, because as we discover more and more in the world that we live in, the environment as a political and public health and cultural issue permeates everything. I think sometimes we've only come to terms with the fact that we have a kind of atmospheric commons that we all share, and we all must act responsibly, in relation to it. But there are, in fact, all kinds of other commons that we share, like a microbial commons around the planet that we have really kind of neglected or failed to understand in many ways. And so ecology and this interconnection between scales, temporalities, and materials, I think is what is at the heart of ecopoetics and what's so fascinating to me and generative about it as a practice or as a, as a kind of.
Well, I think it's very, very important to underscore that poetics is not synonymous with poetry. So like, so when we talk about poetics, we talk about anything that has a form, right? And I noted the expression that you just used, the architecture of thinking. I think that's very useful. I think that's really what we're addressing in this school, yes? In the School of Ecopoetics, I think that's what we work with. We look at the architecture of thinking when it comes to, you know, like cultural vision of the place of human beings in relation to other beings on the planet, to the life-sustaining systems, and so on and so forth. So we look at this architecture and we attempt, in some ways, maybe to remake it, or we try to see how it should be remade, like in what ways it should be remade, and that's poetics. This kind of very deep engagement, yes, into the architecture of thinking is what I understand as poetics, as eco-poetics.
Well, it's hard to solve problems if we don't know how to think about them.
Exactly.
And so, you know, and ecopoetics is about that. You know, not necessarily prescribing a way of thinking about it, but interrogating the questions.
Exactly.
Yeah, of course, and just sort of broadening. Asking different questions.
Yeah. Because you know the problem that I have, the reason why I keep emphasizing this this question of poetics is that I don't especially like this term eco-poetry and the way in which people sometimes use the term equate eco-poetics with eco-poetry as a particular genre of poetry, which is poetry that is somehow especially interested in, let's say, non-human nature. That I find less interesting. I prefer to think about poetics in this sort of original Aristotelian sense as making and as concerning more than just poetry. Having said that, poetry is very important. It's very important. I mean, you're a poet. I am sometimes also a poet, and our school also very often uses poetry as a tool for thinking things through, as a tool for looking at this architecture, if you will. And so I wanted to ask you about, you know, how you think about this, you know, why poetry seems to be so important these days. Why poetry seems to be so privileged when it comes to, you know, as a tool for thinking, as a space for thinking when it comes to these ecological issues. In other ways, what does poetry have to do with ecology? Why does it seem like especially alert, for instance, to the challenges of the Anthropocene? Because it seems to me, maybe I'm mistaken, but it seems to me that poetry, perhaps especially like experimental poetry, responds to the material changes that we're witnessing in the Anthropocene in some of the most inventive ways come from poets. What do you think makes poetry so alert?
Well, I wonder if maybe it's it's slightly different, which is to say, you know, we increasingly live in a world in which you cannot ignore environmental issues and challenges, and poets are, you know, often tuned, very, especially experimental or avant-garde poets tuned to those questions. And so they're going to write about them, they're going to approach them given the centrality and importance that they have right now. But it's hard for me to answer your question in a way because I'm so wrapped up in thinking about poetry and its relationship to the environment that for me these questions seem obvious and interesting and compelling, and I want to explore them. You know, in some ways from my own work in this area, it seems to me, especially given my work with scientists, there's a lot more work that's done in the visual arts in relation to environmental questions and as they might relate to scientific methods and scientific data. There's much less work done in poetry in terms of the kind of thing that I'm doing, where you're working with experiments or working with data from scientific experiments, and partly because that's very difficult. I mean, data visualization is is a part of scientific, I think as a visual artist moving into data visualization, there's, I don't want to say it's easier. I'm just saying I think that there are some channels there that for representation that work a little bit more, naturally, conceptually, and lend themselves to the visual. Whereas dealing with language and trying to, through the medium of language, is often quite difficult. And so, I mean, certainly these are the challenges that I face as I think about how to render the data that I'm collecting with my own work in poetic form. But nonetheless, I mean, these are exciting challenges for me in particular. But, I'll just close this answer just by suggesting, we live in an increasingly, shall we say, textualized world, a world of text. I mean, the internet is address. It's like the oldest poetic form going, the apostrophe. The internet website is a web address. Text is everywhere. I think you could argue that the most prolific forms of communication right now aren't even between people. They're between machines and other machines, sending messages back and forth. So, messages and text is all around us, and in some ways this is, material, raw material for the poet to play with. So, yeah, I mean, just seems like there's endless possibilities.
Okay, and your most recent book, Anatomic, is a really groundbreaking experiment, both in science, yes, and in poetics. So I wonder if you could tell our viewers. I mean, I have talked with you many times, and I have read a lot about this experiment. But if you could tell our viewers what it is and how you worked on this book. And what were some of your objectives in this experiment? That would be wonderful.
So when I finished the polymers, writing that book, I thought a lot about plastics and a lot about the toxicity of plastics. And I was especially taken with endocrine disrupting chemicals. Now, endocrine disruptors, the endocrine system is a system of hormones flying around your body, those messages that regulate all kinds of physiological, metabolic processes. And endocrine disruptors can interfere with these things, and in sometimes very toxic ways. And so I was intrigued by this. I was intrigued that these substances, plastics in the environment, these microscopic substances that we touch can affect the biochemistry of our bodies. And so I started to do research on this, and then I thought, well, this strikes me as a kind of writing, a kind of extreme writing. Not only are we writing our environment by polluting it with plastics, visible plastic pollution, of course, but we're also, we're rewriting our bodies and our biochemistry by putting some of these materials in the environment. So there's a kind of feedback loop happening there. And I was intrigued by this, and so I thought, well, how can I was disturbed as well, but how can I read this writing? Like, can I develop a text out of this? And so I started to essentially what this book is it balances, I suppose, two ways of thinking about how our environment writes the inside of our bodies. So there's the necessary ways, and I do write about microbes in here and bacteria because they play very important roles in regulating our health. And but I also wanted to look at chemical pollution, and so I try to hold these in tension in the book. So I tested myself I tested my blood, my urine, my feces for all kinds of chemicals. They're listed in the book. Things like heavy metals and PCBs, insecticides, flame retardants, these kinds of things. And I sequenced my microbiome as well through a stool sample that I sent away to some universities that were kindly helping me with my research. And I swabbed parts of my body, just trying to get this map, really, this catalog of all the microbes on me. And I didn't know necessarily what I was going to do with this, but I collected all this data. And the idea was to, research some of these. I guess in the end I decided to, in some ways, tell the stories of some of these chemicals that are in me. Not only how some of these chemicals got in me, in many cases I have no idea. I mean, it's just a function of living. In some cases I probably got them from my mother, passed down through me, through breast milk. I think in the poem actually, in the book, it's important for me to emphasize that, you know, women are blamed for so many things in our culture. The last thing I wanted to do was blame my mother for polluting me through breast milk. But I was interested in these mechanisms, and I explore in other ways the kind of inheritance that I have from my mother, that in a more positive way through the microbes that I would have received from her in the act of being born. So these kinds of, you know, the temporal trajectories are part of the book as well, and how the chemicals and microbes move. But this is what I did. I wanted to tell these stories in different ways. So some of the chemicals have quite interesting military, industrial, cultural histories, and some of the microbes do as well in terms of evolution and in terms of their effects on our bodies. So that's how the book is organized in that way. There is a long poem called Hormone that runs through it, because I did kind of imagine the book to be a sort of hormonal stream, and these chemicals and microbial poems would float in among this as it proceeds. But every poem in the book that's about a microbe or a chemical has an epigraph that indicates the particular level of a chemical in my blood or urine, or else of a microbe on or in my body. And this was important. I wanted to ground the data inside the text. And so this, in some ways, is a snapshot of me at a point in time. I may do this again, actually, in 25 or 30 years and see what's changed. I already have a title for that book, actually. I'm just going to call it Delta Triangle Change. You know, what has happened in those 30 years? How have my levels changed? We'll see if I live that long.
What was the most surprising discovery that you made as you were, like, was there anything that especially shocked you, that you discovered in your body that was especially, I don't know, shocking, difficult, surprising?
Well, I deliberately just didn't want to change the way that I lived my life before these tests, because I wanted to see what was in me just as a function of living my daily life. But there was with one exception. I had thought, after writing this book on plastics, I thought I was pretty conscious about plastics. I generally never microwave food in plastics. I try to avoid plastic packaging, etc. I thought I did a pretty good job of that. And so I thought actually I would have low levels of phthalates in my blood, but I did not at all. I had high levels of certain phthalates, which shocked me. That was one thing that shocked me. There were some other quite high levels of a chemical called vanadium, which also shocked me. I have no idea how I got that. It's just sort of associated with diesel fuel and exposures to diesel fuel. So I was shocked at that. I found almost everything that I was looking for, which also was shocking in terms of the chemicals. PCBs and heavy metals, all of those things. I mean, heavy metals are also quite fascinating. Humans have an incredible cultural history with substances like mercury. And in Canada, and I wrote about this as well, in Canada we have a shameful history of environmental racism and pollution related to mercury with Indigenous communities in northwestern Ontario that have suffered from mercury poisoning for 50 years. It's horrible, a case of political neglect and racism, blatant racism. So I wanted to deal with those issues in the book too, and write about those, and this was also a sort of a challenge, thinking about how to write through some of these questions. But because I'm coming through my body, and of course I'm dealing with other bodies in the culture through thinking about this. So how to negotiate that space and difference. But this is how the book is organized. Yeah.
I have one more question before we read some of the poems, and this is a question about metabolism, because I like how you relate, at least two meanings of metabolism, like one referring to the metabolism of an individual body, like your body maybe, and the other meaning of metabolism has to do with this sort of capitalist, like global planetary metabolism, where substances and meanings and bodies circulate. So
well, yeah, I mean, metabolism as a concept is really about energy flows, inputs and outputs, and how organisms, for example, make use of food to extract nutrients from food to make more of themselves, or to maintain their temperature, or to maintain their reproductive capacities, or whatever it is, to live, basically. Creatures need fuel to live, and metabolism is the mechanism by which they extract that fuel from food, or air, breathing, etc. And so you can think of that at a planetary level, of course, too, because we have all kinds of inputs, energy inputs, to maintain our civilization such as it is. And these involve trade routes. I mean, I think this was We realized this quite quickly with the pandemic, the ways in which when you stop that circulation of goods and services around the planet, things change. We're actually still readjusting to this. The metabolism of the planet in terms of its commerce has been affected by the pandemic quite profoundly. But of course, there's other ways in which you might understand, or we might understand the metabolism of the planet, or as would relate to things like the production of fossil fuels and the use of petrochemical energy. Through the burning of fossil fuels to fuel our societies, we have injected all this carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which has created an imbalance. And so this is like a metabolic rift. You get this collection of CO2. And you can extend that, I think, to other cultural circumstances and think about the income inequality, income disparity as a kind of metabolic rift. Why do we live in a world in which it's possible to have billionaires in the way that we do, right? This is the accumulation of money clearly in a system that is not working properly, an out of whack metabolic system. There's other examples of these kinds of metabolic rifts too. And so I wanted to think about this metabolism. I'm interested in thinking about this relationship between the local and global, in part because as I looked into my own body, I could see, the inscription of these planetary global metabolic forces within the local metabolism of my body. And I was quite intrigued by this. And I've sort of expanded this research in different ways. I'm also interested in how it operates in non-human organisms. The signature, essentially, what we do to the world, it does back to us in a sense. We write our environments, but our environments write us too. And it's that kind of inscription, that sort of the legibility of that, and the way to use poetry as a method for rewriting or intervening in some way in these discourses and these inscriptions. That really is where I would locate my poetic practice at the moment. That's the kinds of questions I've been asking.
Okay. Yeah, why don't you read some poems? I'm not sure if I will skip the translations because seems like time is passing really fast. So just if you could read us a few poems from Anatomic, that would be lovely.
Okay, I will start with, I actually may need you to hold the mic for this. Can you do that? Thanks. Okay, so this poem, I'll just take it for 1 second. So this poem is from part of a long poem that deals with phthalates. And so phthalates are materials used to soften plastics. They're in all kinds of things like children's toys to make them soft. They're usually in shower curtains, and they're also in things like cosmetics, and they can be in artificial scents. They're in receipts and thermal paper. So money is often loaded with phthalates because we jam receipts in our wallets, etc. Phthalates are endocrine disrupting chemicals, and they, in particular, they mimic estrogen in the body. And so that can cause all kinds of potential health problems when it comes to physiological development and also cancer. There's asthma and other things have been linked to phthalates and phthalate exposure. The one thing to understand about the endocrine disruptor, if you can imagine the hormone and the function of hormones in the body, they're these chemical messengers that fly around. And I suppose the metaphor that by which we might understand their mechanism is the key into a lock. So the key fits into the lock, and that's the receptor meeting the hormone. But the endocrine disruptor either blocks the lock or behaves like a key in some way. It interrupts this either, so creating an imbalance, a rift, an extra amount of this hormonal substance. So that was the kind of structure that I was using here. I wanted to think about that as part of the construction of this poem. So I'll read it for you now. So this is from Disruptors. This is in response to monobenzyl phthalate. So my urine level is 4.63 nanograms per milliliter. The key in pink eye, and hand in merchandise, and tongue in cheek, and screw in bolt, and butter, and scotch, and coffee, and cups, and dinner in the bell, and periods in the reasons enumerated for failure, and the fly's field of vision in the width of the web, and the tick in the sweat gland, horses in the power, and the guest in the host, and the knock at the door, and the grammar of the dancing reproductive success of the bee in the pollen, and the allergens revolt, deciding inside from out, and the shout in the rooftop, and the drift in the gene, and the spray that comes in from the crops, and the air in the vent, and the vent in the small hours after damage has been spent, and weeping in the willow and empire, and the fiddle and Balkan, and the powder and dark horses in the running, and the absence of questions, and the wandering lust, and the fire in the pine cone, and the halo by virtues of passion in the fruits with substrates in the enzyme, and penis and vagina, and the hetero and normativities, reflexive complementarity and floor tiles in the embryo, and raincoats and testicles, and the call in the response, and the response in the mouth that makes the call.
Read another one. Yes.
Want another from Anatomic?
Yeah, from Anatomic. Yes, read another one from Anatomic.
All right. Okay, so this one, so I had to do a lot of chemical tests. Yes, a lot of chemical tests. Well, when I was doing my microbiome testing, though, because I was working with some scientists and they were helping me with my work and I was helping them with theirs, they wanted me to keep a food diary so they could sort of see what information they could deduce from what I was eating in relation to what I was producing through the stool samples. And so I kept these food diaries, but these were they were kind of traumatic for me, actually. I'd never tracked food in this way before. I became quite obsessive about it. It caused me some anxiety, but this kind of self-scrutiny definitely contributed to the anxiety that I developed writing this book. And I explore this actually in different ways. But and it turns out I thought that I ate pretty healthy. I mean, but it turns out I have a pretty typical Western diet, high in fat and salt and sugar. And there's evidence in my microbiome. Again, we're sort of at the beginning of trying to understand a healthy microbiome. There's lots that scientists don't know about it. But there are some organisms, some microbes that tend to be associated with certain aspects of that diet. So I have some markers here for that are affected by an abundance of sugar in the diet. And so these, I wrote about this. So this poem is called Mouthfeel, and it's for two microbes, one Catinibacteria matsuakai and Bacteroides, which are associated with higher amounts of sugar in the diet. Mouthfeel. The tongue map is wrong. There are buds down to the Commonwealth. What was the bliss point of African blood in the table sugars of Europe? Every year, spinach produces a sugar in its leaves comparable to the world's annual output of iron ore. Without hurting the taste, a young child can stand to keep a hand in cold water longer with a sweet mouth. The faster starch converts to Christianity, the quicker each outreach over police radios. Oh, my sweet tooth, my oatmeal raisin, my poison-tipped candy apple cart. Pleasure from food is the air waving goodbye in heat, distorted like an inherited empire. In this way, we are closest to people who touch what we eat. Captives of loneliness stare into icing. I know enough about the cherry on top to lick around the sides.
Thank you. So as we're coming to the end of this part of the reading, because I hope we can have. Do we have any questions or comments? No. Okay. So when we move on to a discussion with the people who are here later on. As we're coming to the end of our conversation, I wanted to ask you, like before the last bit where you perform over the music, I wanted to ask you, this maybe somewhat naive question about the future and the possibilities for change, and how do you think about this moment of crisis where we are right now, and how do you think about the possibility for agency for us, people in the humanities? How do you think about, I don't know, where do you look for hope, and what do you think? I mean, how do you experience this moment right now, which is a very, very difficult moment with the war? I mean, right now we're next to the war in Ukraine and migration, like what is called migration crisis, which we experience, for example, on our Belarusian border, and of course climate change intensifying. So it's kind of like I think we all have a sense that it's really a pretty stressful moment. I just wonder, you as a poet, as someone who works with these questions, who thinks about these things and researches this moment, right? Anthropocene as a scholar of Anthropocene, really. How do you, what do you think? What do you think we can do? What do you think? How do you feel about this moment and our prospects?
Well, I mean, you're right. I mean, this is a horrible moment, absolutely. And there's so much uncertainty. It feels like we're moving into a different kind of world. I think that all we can do is to keep trying to do our work and trying to make our work better. In some ways, I fall back, I suppose, on the metabolism of my life. Let's just keep one foot in front of the other. I don't have illusions about necessarily writing a poem that will make everything better. I certainly don't, and I know you're not suggesting that. But I do think that the work that we do as scholars and artists is important for reframing some of these discussions and assumptions that get made. I mean, of course, we make decisions all the time, and we make them with available information, and it's so important to have artists and scholars and critics there to offer to reframe these questions so that we understand that, because in many cases there are those forces out there that would prefer that alternatives not be presented, and that that questions be answered in the way that they want them answered. So I think we just have to keep doing our work. We have to, again, I think also, and this is also why I feel a bit inspired, I suppose, about Ecopoetics, is I feel that this is a kind of international, outward-looking a group of artists, or it's not a group, it's open to anyone can participate. But I just think that you're taking the eco seriously. You sort of move across transnational borders quite deliberately, out of necessity in some cases. When you start thinking about your environment, you start thinking about bioregions less. Of course, you think about countries, and that's important. Thinking about migration patterns and the politics of migration is definitely important, absolutely. But I think that it's about thinking beyond the self, beyond the country, the planet generally, but of course how all of these things relate back to the self and the being and those marginalized bodies and people who are caught up in all of these forces. So, we have to keep doing our work and keep trying to have these kinds of conversations and discussions with people around the world. And that's all I have to offer. I think at this point I don't have any other answers beyond that. What do you think, Julia?
Well, I think, I also worry very much. I worry very much. I think, I see that the world, I see that the change is really profound that's happening around us. I also, like for many people in our part of the world, for me, the beginning of the war in Ukraine was a symbolic moment, because of course, there were wars before, and even the war in Ukraine has been going on since 2014. But that moment was like symbolically, I think, ended a certain epoch of comfort. Like it's the end of, like one of our it's actually the expression of one of our students at the School of Ecopoetics who said this about the situation on the Belarusian border, that when she saw that, when she realized that this isn't going to just go away, she realized that this moment is best characterized as the end of comfort. Like we're no longer going to be as comfortable as we were. Like so, this is, I think, I like this description of our moment, that it's the end of comfortable times. We perhaps don't realize how comfortable we were. Like for example, I don't know, in the 90s, yes, but also in the first decade of the 21st century, how comfortable we were, how safe we were. I mean, maybe we weren't safe, but our sense of security was immense. So I also think that, I do think that it's a very critical moment. I do think that it's a very, very difficult moment, very stressful moment, where we're prone to anxiety and even depression and even despair. Despair is a common common experience for people who spend some time with climate science, like to spend time just with this knowledge just gives you depression. Right. At the same time, what I think is, I think it's crucial to keep and protect a sense of agency. And I find a sense of agency, first of all, in doing things together with other people. Like even engaging in a conversation gives us some sort of agency. I think we need to talk about climate change, for instance. We have this great psychologist who is one of our teachers in the School of Ego Poetics, Magdalena Budziszewska, who says, perhaps one of the most important things you can do about climate change is talk to your family over lunch about, that it's actually happening. Actually include this in your everyday conversations, that maybe that's the biggest impact that we can have, yes? So, so I believe it's important to keep and protect this sense of agency, even very locally. So what help? I think thinking locally, thinking in terms of our small communities, of what we're doing as as a community of engaged people is really crucial. It's really fundamental. And I also think what's crucial and fundamental is that there's always something to do. Someone is always going to need your help. You're going to you can always help yourself, and you can always help other people. There is suffering. There's probably going to be more suffering, but there are always things that we can do to reduce this suffering. And for me, that's enough not to feel completely helpless, yes? So rather than thinking in terms of, can we save the earth, or, can we, it's more about these local engagements, like, what is it that I can do right now? What is it that I can do in my community? How can I, help myself right now, help my, the people who, and there's always, if you're open to this possibility, the world will tell you what to do, even small things. So that's my strategy.
Yeah, being open and actually waiting for the message.
Yes.
Being prepared for it at a local level, definitely. Yes. I think, I agree with you. Yeah, I mean, I like your idea too of talking to people, and you could think of that as a kind of micro teaching moment. I mean, without the, I don't want to sort of imply kind of arrogance and sort of, I'm going to teach you now, but you know what I mean. This sort of just sort of, it's there, bringing it up, talking about it,
so that we stop pretending it's not happening. Yes. Because we so often talk about the weather, for instance, and the conventional way of talking about the weather is to always complain that it's raining, for instance, yes, and to be happy. While in this year in Poland, for example, we have had this immense drought that it's actually wonderful that it's raining this week, even though we might not be super happy because we can't go for a walk, but it's really very good news that we have this rain, yes. So even to change our conversation on this level, I think is important.
I agree. Well, I mean, it's great to be in community with you here, to be in dialogue.
Yeah. I mean, it's wonderful to be in dialogue with you, and I think, it's immense pleasure. Okay, so we will play the. Do you want us to play the track now, or do you want to say something before?
Yeah, I'll just say one thing. I just need to dig out my remarks here. So, actually, you know what? I guess I don't need to dig out my remarks. I will just. You can just. Can you just hold that for 1 second? This is an exercise in sound pollution. I've been thinking about the effects of the environment. This is an extension of my thinking about the metabolism of the planet and the metabolism of our bodies. So I've been working with sound and sound pollution, and this will become clear to you what I'm doing here in a second. The loudest sound in recorded history was the volcanic eruption on the island of Krakatoa in Indonesia in 1883. It could be heard almost 5,000 kilometers away. That is the equivalent of a sound in Ireland being heard in Nova Scotia. Ultrasound can help detect tumors, heal sprains, or produce the first images of a baby in utero. Some insects have ears on their legs or under their wings, while some amphibians hear through their lungs. Noises linked to mysterious injuries among foreign diplomats in Cuba were most likely caused by crickets, not microwave weapons. The science fiction film Close Encounters of the Third Kind is based on the premise that a musical chord might be the basis for extraterrestrial communication. The Greeks believed in the music of the spheres. Singing can affect neurotransmitters and hormones such as oxytocin, immunoglobulin A, and endorphins, which improve immune function and increase feelings of happiness. Most humans can't hear frequencies below 20 hertz, but can feel them if the volume is loud enough. The human eyeball will vibrate at 19 hertz. The spinal column at 10 hertz, the lungs at 8 hertz, and the heart at 5 hertz. The World Health Organization has classified traffic noise, including road, rail, and air traffic, as the second most important cause of ill health in Western Europe, behind only air pollution. Prolonged exposure to environmental noise can lead to negative cardiovascular and hormonal changes, as well as reduced cognitive performance in children. The earliest reports of a strange infrasonic hum came from Bristol, England in the 1970s. It first appeared in the United States in the late 1980s in Taos, New Mexico. Recently, it has been reported in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. Audible most frequently at night, the hum sounds like a distant idling engine or an approaching train that never arrives. Conspiracy theories claim the hum is caused by ghosts, by aliens, or even by mating fish. Other more scientific theories propose that the hum is a response in sensitive people to low-frequency military communications with distant submerged submarines. Some researchers think that the hum is the accumulation of anthropogenic sound around the planet, everything from highway noise, construction, to all manner of human industrial activity, a kind of standing wave. Others propose that the hum is not an external sound at all, but a form of tinnitus, resulting from subtle but widespread hearing damage after the introduction of new drugs in the 1970s, such as modern antibiotics and anti-inflammatory medications. Sound is inside and outside. It affects our bodies. It is produced by our bodies. You are listening to an approximation of the hum, with embedded sound waves at 20 hertz that you cannot hear. Perhaps you can feel them. Perhaps you are already intimately familiar with them. Do you hear it at night? Do you hear the hum? The recordings of my voice you will hear in the following track were captured using a hydrophone, which is a contact mic usually used underwater. I placed the hydrophone on different parts of my body to capture my voice resonating through soft tissues, organs, bones, hormones, and blood. The text for the piece you will hear next was created from descriptions of the hum from people around the world, These descriptions are collected as part of the World Hum Database Project, a research initiative dedicated to the mystery of the hum.
The refrigerator motor, generator in the distance, forced air, a harmonic produced by vibrations hitting our home, a constant pitch, low droning like it's outside the house, wind blowing heavily in the sky down the street, the distant airplane engine coming in waves during the night, World War II bombers my wife doesn't hear, the cell phone sound when you get another phone too close during a call, a rotating mosquito moan, pulsing underground bass in the in yoga, more internal than external, stops and starts like Morse code, an earthquake plate, the lawnmower cutting a meadow of bees, vacuum above ground, the deep throb, an unbalanced dryer under fluorescent lights before they die in another room. First time I thought, why are they cleaning the drains this late? Standing waves hovering off the coast in poor weather, changing from mono to stereo. Worse upstairs, but softens when I shake my head. An approaching train that never passes, monotone, horrendous at night. My shirt slightly vibrates on my back when yawning. It can last for hours or days. Traveling music with no beat, ticking over. A car waiting outside in winter with the windows closed. A large lorry going uphill. Old TVs just turned on. The neighbor's ventilation. Two airplane motors running at the same time. A cross between a siren and a bad audio connection. A muffled prop, heard while swimming. Sinus shake. The helicopter. The turbine. The tuning fork hit. A park juggernaut. Propeller-driven planes chopping trees. Your head in a lake with speedboats on top. Air-conditioned pipes running with water connected to a sink. And a sustained note of a pipe organ, using a different sense in your head to hear rather than your hearing. A guitar string that you can only pick up at the bottom of a large ferry, yet you are far from any harbor. A car in a tunnel muted and cupped in my ear. A speaker that has nothing to play. An F sharp, 2 octaves below middle C. The mating sounds of locusts coming from power sockets right outside the house, vibrating the timber and window glass. If I move my head, it pauses, but not steady, in both ears. The wind blowing over a large bottle. I can feel it inside me.
That is amazing, thank you. So do you think you'll do more work with sound in the future? Is this something that is...
I want to, yeah, I do. I do want to do more work with sound for sure. I mean, I think it's really interesting. As my work has been drifting, thinking about metabolism and this writing of the global metabolism as it affects the local metabolism of our bodies. I've been drawing more to thinking about the senses and how these are both a site from which, a frame through which we experience the world, but also a site for all kinds of anthropogenic pollution and changes, right? Light pollution, sound pollution, antibiotic pollution in terms of the microbial commons, and even sense of touch in terms of heat, or the taste. I mean, I could go on and on. I just, for me, it's like, so I've been drawn to this idea, and I've been finding different ways to think about this relationship between anthropogenic changes and metabolic effects from sound. So, as one example. So yes, I hope to play more with sound.
Okay, we'll have time maybe for 1 or 2 questions. Is there anything you wanted to ask or comment, or? Oh, Asha? Oh, Maciek, yeah, okay, great. Do you need a mic, or like how should I do it? Yeah, okay.
Thank you. So I'd like to start by saying that it must have taken enormous courage to do all of those lab tests. And I think the sound recording we just heard was like a recording of the effects of those lab tests. I mean, your body started telling you something about what was happening inside it. And now the epitome of those tests just came up. And like the disquieting effect of the recording actually, to my mind, is like the voice of those polymers talking from inside the bodies you wrote about. So that's a comment. And then, a question actually Julia already started formulating. So how will this sound become a formal constraint in your poetics? I mean, how will you use it to to shape, to mold your writing, because you do that with letters, for instance, right? When you read from Haltertop, you only used specific letters to create the poem, and so what will you do with sound? So that's my question. If you know, maybe there's no answer to that one.
Yeah, well, I'm still playing around with it. I've done a few things already that I plan to incorporate. So I listened to these sounds, and I did some electrodermal tests on myself. So those are I actually used a lie detector test, which is sort of it's a fancy. I mean, it's just it's like a polygraph. So a polygraph does several things at once. Lie detection is more or less based on skin conductance. So I had this thing on my finger, and supposedly when you lie, the temperature of your skin changes ever so slightly, and these things pick this up. But all kinds of other stimuli can do this to you, and not just if you're lying. And so sound was one thing and so I wanted to listen to this to see. And usually, if there are spikes like this in the electrodermal test, it indicates a kind of spike of a stress hormone or something like this. There's a change happening. If you're frightened, for example, you will spike on the electrodermal chart, and that's usually the release of a hormone in response to that fear. And so I wanted to see if listening for prolonged experience to these sounds, because certainly people around the world claim to suffer all kinds of problems from these from the hum, among other things. So I was just curious about that. And so I mean, this is not a a controlled scientific experiment. It was done on a very small scale. So I have this data. There are different ways in which I'm tempted to work with it, but I haven't yet. But that remains a horizon for me about subjecting myself for longer periods of time to this sound to see what other effects it might elicit, and then working with that data. But that remains at the moment a horizon. But you're right about thank you for your earlier comment. That's an interesting reading, connecting the sort of urgency and mania of, or the anxiety, I suppose, of that piece as it might connect to as an accumulation. Yes, as a kind of sonic accumulation of my own anxiety around the chemical tests. Because it's true, I learned way too much information. Yeah, be careful what TMI, yes.
Maciek, you wanted also to ask a question?
So I wanted to make a comment about the hum. Basically, that not the second part with the microphone with you speaking through your body, but the first part of the hum. Yeah. It was a really horrible experience for me listening through that, and I wonder, was it supposed to be this horrible? Because I really struggled to sit here. You wanted to run out of the room? I wanted to get out, really. I really struggled to sit.
Well, let me ask you, what was bothering you, the sound?
Yeah, the sound. So some parts of the sounds, parts of the frequencies made me uncomfortable.
Well,
and I just wonder, was that the intention, right? I assume that it was the intention.
Well, it is the intention. It is. However, the other times that I presented this, I usually give a little bit of a warning. Maybe I should have done that. No, I'm serious, because it's true. And different people are sensitive to sound in different ways. There were some wavelengths in there that would be uncomfortable for some people to experience. Now, I never know precisely the kind of sound system we're dealing with, so I don't know how present some of those wavelengths will be, but there's some really long wavelengths of several meters that probably take most of the length of this room to propagate and come back, and those can actually be disturbing to some people to experience. So I apologize for that. However, it is kind of part of it as well, but I should have, if I'd warned you, perhaps you would have braced yourself.
No, I mean, I don't hold a grudge or anything.
No.
I just that, because later you said that you're wondering how this anxiety-inducing effect, can it do to people if they are exposed to such sounds for a prolonged period of time?
Yeah.
And I have a feeling that being exposed to this for, I don't know, for something like an hour would already do something bad for me.
Yeah.
So
No, absolutely. I think, as I think about the senses too, and the work that I'm doing, I'm trying to think about what it means to sort of work immersively within some of these issues and problems. So hence you know, putting my own body in some of that. However, I've realized that now as I think about performing this, I'm also immersing my audience in some of these experiences, and that has unpredictable effects. So, no, thank you for telling me about
For me, it works definitely, yeah.
yeah.
Okay, thank you to all of you who have been watching us today, and thank you, Adam. Huge thanks for this conversation and for being here.
Thank you, my pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you.